And our guest speaker tonight is going to be Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. And at this point, let me ask Dr. Tsahaye, ECDC Director.
Good evening. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Good. Well, I want to welcome you to this annual event. As you know, we have an annual event that has three components. The first day was devoted to training of our network from around the country. The last 2 days have been the national conference on African refugees and immigrants, where our members of the network had an opportunity to visit Capitol Hill to dialogue and educate their members of Congress on the various issues facing African newcomers here and African refugees and migrants in the various parts of the world. Today we had an occasion to take some of the leadership to the White House, where we met with the National Security Staff and also members from the various federal agencies, including Homeland Security, Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, the Small Business Administration, and Department of Labor. During our conversation with the National Security Staff and the other federal agencies, our point of concern were expressed to them. This includes the anti-immigrant violence that we have seen in South Africa, the pending closure of the refugee camp in Kenya by the Kenyan government, the conflict in Yemen and how it's affecting our refugees and immigrants, primarily from the eastern part of Africa. We also had an opportunity to discuss recent tragedy that has happened to Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees and migrants in Libya, as well as the thousands of migrants who have been fleeing from various North African countries to Europe and who have lost their life. These are points of concern that we have shared with both the administration and the legislative body yesterday and today. These are people who need our attention, especially at this hour of their need. Now, having said that, then the third component of our program is the annual dinner that we conduct every year here. This is to celebrate the achievements and contributions of African newcomers in our communities. Tonight, I am very pleased to have amongst us a friend whose relationship with ECDC and me personally goes to many years back when she was a junior officer at the Department of State, overseeing some of the refugee programs. It is really a great pleasure for me to introduce you our speaker, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is the Assistant Secretary of State in the Africa Bureau. Ambassador Linda has served in numerous capacities, both here in the United States as well as abroad. Among her portfolio, she has served as Ambassador to Liberia. She was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Refugee and Migration. She was also the Principal Deputy at the Department of State African Bureau, where she is now the Assistant Secretary. She has been posted abroad in Geneva, as well as in Kenya and Pakistan. It is really a pleasure to welcome Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is a personal friend to our community. Ambassador.
Thank you, Sahai, and I really feel like I'm back at home. I've moved on, but I see so many friends here who I have met over the years since I started working on refugee issues. So I really do feel like I have come back home. So thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. I have to tell you that I just got off the plane this morning from India. And you probably ask, what does India have to do with Africa? We actually had a strategic dialogue with the Indians, led by our Undersecretary Wendy Sherman. And one of the things they wanted to talk about was Africa. So I flew to India on Monday night, got there Tuesday night, had meetings all day on Wednesday, got back on the plane Wednesday night, and arrived back this morning. And part of the reason I did that is Sahai, because I had committed last year that I would speak, and Secretary Kerry decided to go to Africa. And when your secretary is going to your region, you can't not go. And at the last minute, I had to cancel out. Well, guess what? The secretary is going to Africa again. And I was praying that it wouldn't be on the 30th. He actually gets there on Sunday. So I get back on the plane tomorrow at 3 o'clock. To go to Kenya, so that I'm in Kenya on Sunday when Secretary Kerry arrives. So I apologize in advance if I put you to sleep as I'm falling asleep. But I'll try my best to keep you interested. I am really here because of ECDC and the great work that you and all the organizations represented here tonight are doing as you work on behalf of refugees from across Africa and other regions of the world. And this is work that contributes to our broader goals, our mission on the continent of Africa. Helping refugees and international migrants is a duty we take very seriously in the State Department. And while PRM, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which I also consider to be my home in the State Department, has the primary responsibility for dealing with refugees, the Bureau for African Affairs also is very well connected and very committed to supporting the efforts that PRM puts forth in supporting refugees. It's an issue that I've worked on extensively throughout my career, going back to the late 1980s, working on refugee admissions in what was then what we call RP, the refugee program. And I first worked with ECDC and subsequently throughout the 1990s as a refugee coordinator in Kenya and Pakistan, and eventually as our refugee counselor in Switzerland. So tonight I want to do a few things. I want to talk a bit about our humanitarian assistance efforts, but my main goal, my main purpose is to talk more broadly about U.S. policy in Africa. I also want to hear from you and get your questions if we have time, since I can't cover every single topic in a speech. It's easier to cover those things you're interested in if I allow you time to ask questions, so I'll try to leave time for that. So let me start out discussing our vision for Africa. Several weeks ago, a young journalist, I was doing an interview on VOA, and a young journalist from Burkina Faso asked me, what is your vision for Africa in 2020? And my response was, our vision is the African vision. It is a vision of democracy, of security and prosperity for the people of Africa. Indeed, in the Bureau of African Affairs, our mission is to partner with the people and the governments of Africa to achieve that vision. We strongly believe that Africa's prosperity depends on its greatest resource, its people, and I know that all of you share that belief. Without prosperity, people take risks to find a better life. That is what we're seeing as we see thousands of migrants leave Africa to take that dangerous and, in many cases, deadly trip across the Mediterranean. Let me start by talking about our vision of strong democracy on the continent. A few weeks ago, I had the immense honor to lead the U.S. election observation mission to Nigeria. And I do consider that it was an honor, as I did when I served as an observer to the mission in Liberia in 2006, when Liberians elected the first woman president of Africa, and later in 2011, when I was the ambassador to Liberia and President Sirleaf was reelected. I spoke this afternoon to the Nigerian diaspora community, and I shared with them the experience I had and the feelings that I had being in Nigeria during that historic moment. I was inspired, to say the least, to witness committed Nigerian citizens participating in the democratic lives of their country. I spoke to an elderly man who brought his own chair to the voting site, and he got in line very early in the morning to line up to be accredited to vote at 8 a.m. and like many others, he didn't see that as the end. He waited for hours just to cast his vote, and he didn't go home even after that. He waited even more hours to make sure that his vote was counted. That, to me, was amazing. Imagine Americans. Imagine all of you. How many of you get up in the morning at 6 a.m. to go vote? How many of you actually vote? 25% of Americans normally vote in local elections. I vote in Arlington County, and when I go out at 6 a.m. in the morning, there's nobody in line. Absolutely nobody. Maybe my husband may be the number 2 person, and if we're lucky, we may see 3 or 4 others. We don't appreciate our rights to vote in this country. Africans appreciate their right to vote, and Nigerians showed us how much they appreciated that right. Both President Jonathan and now President-elect Buhari pledged repeatedly to refrain from election-related violence, and they urged their supporters to show restraint. President Jonathan demonstrated his statesmanship by conceding the election as soon as the results became apparent and vowing to work with his successor. President-elect Buhari graciously acknowledged the call and pledged his commitment to honor the will of the Nigerian people. The United States, on our part, look forward to working with the new government that was elected by the people of Nigeria. When I did the diaspora call this morning, someone said to me on the call, you said the U.S. government did not have a candidate, but you were supporters of Buhari, and you know that you were supporters of Buhari. We were not supporters of Buhari. We were not supporters of President Jonathan. We were supporters of the Nigerian people, and the Nigerian people determine their future, and we look forward to working with the people, and I think the Nigerian people deserve a hand of applause, and I ask it to be. With its size and economic role on the continent, the stakes for this election could not have been higher for Nigeria and for the world. Africa's largest country truly demonstrated that it is Africa's largest democracy. Nigeria's democracy today is stronger than it was before this election, and we know that it will continue to get stronger. And we've also seen peaceful elections in other countries in Africa, in Mozambique, in Lesotho, in Namibia, and in Zambia. For us, it's also important to recognize these successes as we hope that the trend continues for the more than a dozen elections scheduled between now and the end of 2016, including in Ethiopia next month, in Burundi later this summer, and the Democratic Republic of Congo next year. Let me share a couple of thoughts on Ethiopia, since so many of you are from Ethiopia, since I also visited Ethiopia with Undersecretary Wendy Sherman a few weeks ago. This visit was a follow-up to President Obama's meeting with Prime Minister Haile Mariam last year on the margins of UNGA. In Ethiopia, we met with senior government officials as well as civil society leaders while we were there. We have a strong partnership with Ethiopia, and we collaborate on a range of regional, security, development, and economic issues. We appreciate the strong role that Ethiopia plays in the region in countering al-Shabaab in Somalia and supporting the peace negotiations in South Sudan. In addition, Ethiopia has made significant progress on achieving the Millennium Development Goals. At the same time, we're engaged in a dialogue with the government about allowing greater space for civil society, independent media, political pluralism, and we want to urge the government to uphold the fundamental human rights that are guaranteed by Ethiopia's constitution and its international obligations. While Undersecretary Sherman was there, she expressed our concerns about media freedom and noted the fact that there are more journalists in jail in Ethiopia than in any country in Africa. We noted Ethiopia's upcoming election, and we believe that every election, just as it did in Nigeria, every election should be better than the one that preceded it, and independent media and space for independent opposition voices are essential for a free and fair election. Certainly, Ethiopia has a ways to go to ensure that every citizen's voice can be heard, whether at the ballot box or in the media. But we believe strongly that we must recognize Ethiopia's achievements just as we do with any other country, and we must continue to engage with the government as the best means to advance and advocate for the important values of free speech, open society, and political pluralism. Our efforts to support democracy and governance in Africa focus on more than just elections. We contribute to strengthening institutions and building a civil society capacity that are critical to long-term stability. Respect for constitutionally mandated term limits is a huge part of that. Changing constitutions for personal or political gain and eliminating term limits reduces people's confidence in their institutions, and it weakens overall governance. And when leaders try to change the Constitution to adjust or eliminate term limits, we're seeing citizens rise up to protest. We saw that in Burkina Faso when protests against President Compaore's attempt to change term limits ultimately caused him to resign. We're seeing that debate taking place in a number of countries where term limits limited leaders are reaching the end of their elected mandates. Respect for term limits and constitutions and for the role of civil society are a crucial part of realizing the aspirations of the entire continent, and we continue to push countries on this issue. Let me talk a bit about our vision for peace. In too many places, the aspirations of young Africans are thwarted by political instability, armed conflict, and violent extremism. The al-Shabaab attack last month on Garissa University College of Kenya is a recent example of the horrific brutality of violent extremism. At least 147 university students and security forces were attacked and killed. So many of these were young people pursuing an education in hopes of contributing to their communities and their countries in the future. Kenya and the United States have been partners for more than 50 years. We've been working together with the Kenyan government to provide a wide range of security assistance. This includes essential advice, includes training and equipment to Kenya's military and law enforcement units working to degrade al-Shabaab's operatives and refute its ideology. The United States emphasizes the need to respect human rights and rule of law in all of its security assistance programs and in all of its engagements with the Kenyan government. And we've stressed the importance of refugee protection as Kenya hosts more than 300,000 refugees. Many of those refugees have been supported by ECDC in coming to the United States. Kenya remains a key partner in countering terrorism, and as the President said after the attacks in Garissa, and I quote, "We will stand hand in hand with the Kenyan government and people against the scourge of terrorism and in their efforts to bring communities together," unquote. Northern Nigeria and its neighbors, including Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, are also facing a deadly threat with Boko Haram. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb continues to be active in the Sahel. And let me be clear, this violence is not just occurring in Africa. It is happening all around the world. Violent extremist threats can come from a range of groups and individuals, including domestic terrorists and homegrown extremists in the United States, as well as global terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL. In the African context, we know that achieving our shared peace and security goals depends on cooperating with and strengthening our partners' security institutions. And you may ask, what are we doing to support Africa's efforts against terrorism? Last August, during the historic U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, President Obama launched two very important initiatives on this front. The first, the Security Governance Initiative, SGI. SGI is a multi-year effort that will initially focus on 6 countries: Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Mali, Niger, and Tunisia. The initiative emerged out of consultations with our African partners who said they wanted a more strategic and sustained approach to security sector reform efforts. The second was the African Peacekeeping Rapid Response Partnership, or what we normally refer to as APREP. Our peacekeeping assistance programs like the African Contingency Operations Training and Assistance Program, and now APREP, are also critical to our ability to address both current and future conflicts on the continent. Through APREP, the United States will work to build the capacity of security forces to deploy rapidly in emerging African crises. I must stress, however, that security agencies alone cannot resolve conflict and fight transnational challenges like violent extremism. Governments must also partner with civil society, with communities at risk, with non-governmental organizations to work together to discredit violent extremist messages, discourage recruitment, and provide sound alternatives, and to address the root causes of discontent among vulnerable youth. The United States is providing programming, training, opportunities for youth and marginalized communities to complement and bolster security assistance-related programs. Taken together, these initiatives are an important part of the long-term strategies for peace and prosperity that we were pursuing with our partners in Africa, despite the challenges that we face. Some of these challenges, however, require immediate humanitarian response, and through the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, through USAID, through other humanitarian agencies, the State Department has provided significant funding in the last fiscal year to assist and protect refugees, as well as internally displaced and other vulnerable populations. These funds supported the important work of international organizations, of NGOs in protecting and assisting people most in need, including new refugees fleeing crises in Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Nigeria. They also helped organizations find solutions for refugees, including repatriation when possible, local integration in generous countries such as Tanzania and Zambia, and resettlement in third countries, as we have done here in the United States through organizations like ECDC. We are particularly proud of the fact that we've resettled 17,000 Africans in FY 2014, more than doubling the number of African admissions since 2011, and we're working hard to increase the number to even more in the years to come. When I started in the Bureau of Refugees back in 1989, we succeeded in bringing a little over, I think it was like 1,934 refugees. So the number used to be stuck in my head. I'm getting a little old now, so I don't remember numbers so well. But I was the refugee resettlement officer, and the ceiling for Africa was 2,000. And we couldn't reach that ceiling for any number of reasons, including the fact that we didn't put the resources and the commitment into reaching that number. And my goal back in 1989, when I was a young junior officer, as Sahai described me, was to help us reach that number. And I did everything possible to get us to that 2,000. And we got just under it. We reached the 1,900, we got over 1,900, and suddenly the fiscal year was over, and we didn't reach 2,000. I felt like an abject failure. Everybody said to me, I did a great job because we got to 1,900, because previous years, I think we may have gotten to like 900, and sometimes even lower numbers. And Sahai tells me back when, were bringing in numbers under 100. And my goal was always to reach 25,000 when I was in that job. And I think for a couple of years we did get up to 25,000. When we look at the needs across the African continent, when we look at the fact that there are 3 generations of refugees in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, refugees have been born in Dadaab, refugees have had babies in Dadaab, refugees have died in Dadaab. When I worked in Kenya as a refugee coordinator, the refugee population was around 120,000. And it was a safe camp. I used to go to Dadaab and sleep in the refugee camps. Now I'm told we can't even go to Dadaab to visit. And we have to find a way to provide protection to those refugees in Dadaab refugee camp so that they can feel safe and secure. And every country, whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's crime, they look for a scapegoat. And in the case of Kenya, the scapegoat is now the refugees in Dadaab. And we have on our agenda raising this with the Kenyan government, impressing upon the Kenyan government the importance of continuing to provide protection to those refugees in Dadaab. They are victims. They are not the problem. They have been equally victimized by Al-Shabaab, and we need to make sure that protection continues to be part of the support that we provide for them. Finally, let me talk about our vision of prosperity. As the diaspora community knows all too well, Africa's economic outlook is often overshadowed by the bad headlines. And I always tell people when I get up in the morning, because they ask me, how do you continue to do this job? You wake up in the morning, I get up at 5, I look at my BlackBerry, Al-Shabaab has taken, nearly 300 Nigerian girls. Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab has attacked a university. It's like every single day. And if I let that bad news be what I'm about as the Assistant Secretary for Africa, I wouldn't get up and come to work in the morning. So I need to focus, we need to focus on that part of Africa that provides a future, that part of Africa that provides the hope and prosperity for the young people of Africa. And so I do like to spend my time talking about trade and investment because it's an important part of our Africa policy. The reality is that opportunities abound for U.S. businesses and investments in Africa. The sub-Saharan region is physically larger than the United States, China, India, and Western Europe combined. I've seen a map that has everything transposed on the continent of Africa. With its wealth of natural resources that can help propel the continent's people to new heights of prosperity if this wealth is utilized wisely. The continent has an average percent annual growth of 5.2%, and 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on the continent of Africa. We're seeing a growing middle class, a burgeoning youth population with large appetites for goods and services, and in fact, average per capita income has become increasing steadily over the last decade and a half. Sectors like manufacturing, energy, and retail are all expanding, as are construction and telecommunications markets. For many African leaders, the Business Forum was the highlight of their visit to Washington last summer during the Africa Leaders Summit. The Leaders Summit yielded $33 billion in new trade and investment commitments from U.S. companies, in Africa. President Obama also announced $7 billion in new financing to promote U.S. exports to and investments in Africa under the Doing Business in Africa campaign. Expanded access to electricity is crucial to this business development and growth, and that's why President Obama announced the tripling of our Power Africa goal to create 30,000 megawatts of clean energy and to power at least 60 million households and business connections in Africa. With $6 billion in new private sector commitments and a total commitment under Power Africa, we are now at about $20 billion. And this is significant. Power in Africa is extraordinarily significant. all of you have flown across Europe into the continent of Africa, and you see the lights as you're flying from Europe, and suddenly you cross over the Mediterranean, and it's dark. You see dots of electricity, but you don't see power on the continent of Africa. Power is what is going to generate prosperity on the continent of Africa. If young people do not have electricity in their schools, they cannot study. If hospitals do not have electricity, people cannot get adequate health care. If businesses do not have electricity, they will not prosper. Electricity is the key to Africa's future. We're also hard at work at renewing the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA. When the U.S. Congress passed AGOA 15 years ago, it was a watershed moment in our relations with Africa. And today, it remains the foundation of our trade relations. Many of you in the advocacy community are working to make sure that AGOA is reauthorized in a timely fashion, and I thank you very much for that. It is hopeful that we'll get AGOA renewed over the next couple of weeks, and I encourage you to continue to engage with your members of Congress to encourage the passing of this legislation sooner rather than later. And then finally, we're looking forward to July of 2015, when the Global Entrepreneurship Summit will take place in Kenya. This summit, this event will bring entrepreneurs from all over the world, but of course, it will feature a very special participant. As many of you know, President Obama just announced that he will visit Kenya in conjunction with the GES. And before that, as I mentioned earlier, next week, Secretary Kerry will head to Nairobi and Djibouti, and we're excited about both of these stops, but in particular about Djibouti, where he will be the first sitting Secretary of State to visit that country ever. Finally, let me end on a positive note. One of the great programs that we had last summer when we brought the African leaders in was a program called YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative. We brought 500 of the most extraordinary young Africans to the United States to participate in a 6-week educational program. They applied for this. It was extraordinarily competitive. We had 50,000 applicants from across Africa who completed the application process. We only chose 500. They went to 20 universities across the U.S. where they studied leadership in entrepreneurship, in public service, and in civil society. And then they came to Washington for a 1-week summit in which they met leaders across the Washington area, including President Obama. We see this program as being a legacy for us in Africa, because it is these young people, these extraordinarily smart, creative, ambitious young people who will be the leaders in the future on the African continent. And when I travel, I try to meet with all the YALI fellows. I encourage all of our ambassadors to do it. I encourage any of our people who are visiting Africa to meet with these young people, because every single one of them will be a leader in whatever it is they choose to pursue. And we have to support them, we have to mentor them, and we have to support them. The next group of young African leaders are, I think, on their way right now. I think they come into the United States around the end of May for a new six-week program. And then next year we were able to get funding to bring in 1,000, and 1,000 in 2017. And this is just a drop in the bucket. Africa is one of the youngest continents in the world. 60%, maybe 70 or 75%, I get my numbers mixed up, are 25 and under. These are young people who need to be vested in the futures of their country. These are young people who have to be mentored, they have to be trained, they have to be prepared for the future. Otherwise, they will join Al-Shabaab, they will join Boko Haram, they will get on planes from the United States and everywhere and join ISIL and become a problem. So we have to invest in them if we want to ensure Africa's prosperity in the future. Let me conclude by again thanking Sahai, thanking all of you, thanking ECDC, its affiliates, for the work that you do to welcome and support refugees from around the world. Many of you as members of the diaspora and many of you actually, have come to the United States as refugees. But you embody the strong ties between the United States and the people and nations of Africa. Through remittances and support for projects, you're also a major source for assistance on the continent. So I thank all of you in supporting the people of Africa and advocating for the continent of Africa and for everything you do for Africa's future. Thank you very much. Questions? I have.
I thank you for your service, really. I have a two-part question. One, you talked about your vision 2020 Africa. Before President Obama leaves the office, is there a plan for him to visit Ethiopia? Because the last time AU celebrated the 50th anniversary, I was really disappointed, very disappointed. Not only that, Ethiopia is a very historical country. Ethiopia was a country that was never colonized, supported every African freedom movement. It's a very significant gesture, really. So I think I'm asking this question on behalf of Ethiopians. We were really puzzled. I just heard that he's going to Kenya, but is he planning on visiting Ethiopia? Former President Bush has visited, Africa, Ethiopia a dozen times. So that's one question. The other one is, as someone who's in charge of Africa, are you worried that the Chinese are dominating Africa? We have not seen enough effort from the United States in terms of capacity building. We have to graduate from development aid to capacity building. So these are the things that I would like for you to address. Thank you.
Well, first, I don't think I've spoken to a group that has not asked if the president is visiting their country. I can only say that those decisions are made at the White House, and I will convey your passion for having the president visit Ethiopia to my colleagues at the White House. Again, the president does quite extensive travel, not just to Africa. I'd love to have him visit every single country in Africa. But again, we'll have to ask that question to our colleagues at the White House. And you won't be surprised that I have not done an event where I've not been asked about Chinese in Africa. And my answer is always the same. We're not worried about the Chinese in Africa. My question to Africans, are you worried about the Chinese in Africa? We have been in the United States has been in Africa for more than a half century. We were there from the start. We have supported Africa in ways that we can't even put value to. We're probably the only country in the world, and China is nowhere near us, that has a diaspora that includes people from every single African country. So we are part of Africa. Africa is part of us. Our companies are investing in Africa. We'd like to see more investments. But what I say to African leaders, when they are negotiating with the Chinese, it is up to them to get the best deal that they can get for their people. And what we say to the Chinese is that they have to provide a level playing field. Their companies cannot be paying bribes because our companies cannot pay bribes. We hold our companies accountable. I've told the Nigerians that the only people who go to jail for corruption in Nigeria, in the United States, are Americans. So a level playing field is an important part of getting American companies to invest in the same way that the Chinese are investing. I think the Chinese have tremendous resources that they can bring to Africa in terms of infrastructure, in terms of financing, but Africans have to make sure that those deals are deals that are in their best interest. They're not high interest, low dividend loans, that it is actually a partnership. We see Africa as a partner. We're moving more and more away from development assistance to partnering with Africans and partnering with companies to invest in Africa. Trade Africa is not about it's not about bringing in U.S. Development assistance. It's about supporting the capacity of Africans to trade with each other and also do more in terms of trade with the United States. Power Africa is all about the business sector. It's about opening up an environment that encourages the private sector to come in and invest in power generation in the country. So I think we have shown our commitment to Africa, and we want the Chinese to show their commitment to Africa as well.
One more big question. Well, I think people are...
No follow-up. We'll talk later.
I think people are hungry. So.
They're hungry. So am I.